Welcome. Welcome to the secret life of cells. I told you I would try to be entertaining as well as educational, so please admire my ensemble here.
It's adorable.
This is a lab coat that has 3 different kinds of cells on it. This is a nerve pathway. We start with a sensory neuron. This part up here would be originating in maybe your taste buds, or maybe the retina of your eye, a rod or a cone, maybe a pressure or temperature receptor in your fingers. Those are the sensory neurons, and they attach to or are stimulated by some sort of stimulus from your environment. Now, there are some inside of you that are stimulated by other internal signals, like when you, let's see, the brain part that tells you that you need to yawn would get a stimulus from one of your blood vessels that tells you that there's too much carbon dioxide in your blood and you need to yawn so that it will have you take a bigger deep breath. But for the most part, we think of them as being stimulated by something in the environment. That information passes along nerves up to your brain where it decides what to do about it. And the neurons, is it over here? This neuron is called an interneuron, and it's you will find them in your brain and your spinal cord. And they are your analysis neurons. They decide what to do with the information that comes in from the sensory neuron. And once they've decided, then they will send an impulse back out to a muscle, maybe so that if you put your hand on something hot, it tells you to pull it back, or something like that. Or also a secretory gland or organ, like a sweat gland, that might, oh, I'm hot. Oh, what do I do about being hot? Oh, I sweat to cool me off. So this is a pathway. It's a lot like your computer, input, decision, and then output kind of thing. So that's my ensemble for you today. Here's 3 different kinds of cells. When you hear the word cell these days, people think mostly about cell phones. That's the first thing, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the cells that make up living things. And so here we have a living cell trying to use a cell phone, looking as confused as much of us do when we try to use our cell phone. And then over here, one of the things that cells do is divide to make more cells. And so this cell is talking on the phone, telling his friend that it's going to be a little late because he's got to divide, and then the 2 of them will be in touch with you about lunch later. So lots of cartoons of the different kinds of cells. So what is a cell? Well, it's the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all living organisms. That's mostly true. Where that definition falls apart is when we talk about viruses. Viruses don't qualify with all the characteristics that cells have. For example, they can't reproduce themselves. They have to infect a cell to reproduce. But all other things are cellular in life. It's the smallest unit that can replicate independently and carry on all of the life processes. It's been called the building block of life. If you imagine an individual made up of, or a building made up of bricks, like all of our bricks there, each of those bricks might be a cell that's building something bigger, that's building an organism, individual, okay? And it's also correct to call it a DNA decoding machine, because one of the major things that it does is to read the information that's in the DNA and turn that into instructions that then the cell or the whole organism can follow through on, like growing, for example. Okay. I like this quote from Alfred North Whitehead, that living cells are to biology what electrons and protons are to physics. They are the basics of biology, of living things. So here's some examples of organisms that are made up of only one cell. And when we think of ourselves, we think, oh, lots of cells, but there are lots of organisms out there that are a whole organism. It's just one single cell. And this one is an amoeba. You may have heard of those. Yeah. Up there above it is a paramecium. You may have heard of those, because those are often ones that you see in basic biology class. Down here is a rotifer, and all three of those are regular residents of our pond water. So if I had a microscope and could bring you a drop of pond water in to look at, you would see all three of those. These rotifer, all of them are so fast and they're moving around that scientists have created this little, almost like gel to slow them down so that you can see them. Because as soon as you get it focused on your microscope, it zips away. Wow. So we have to use a trick to slow it down so we can see it. There's another unicellular organism, and these are algae cells. You see that they're green. They have the chloroplasts in them, which are the little structures that do the photosynthesis and make them green. Do you suppose algae use green light to make sugar? No, that's the color they don't use. They reflect it back to your eyes, and that's what you see. They're using red light and blue light to power the photosynthesis process. All right, so those are some single-cell organisms. Here are samples of some multicellular organisms, and all these, well, let's see, not all of them. So some of them are tightly packed together. This is what snake skin looks like under the microscope. Okay. And up there, that's the blade of a leaf in cross-section. So it's got a top layer and a bottom layer, and then these tall cells in the middle. It's where the photosynthesis is taking place, the conversion of carbon dioxide and water into sugar. Very important for us to eat. Up here, this is a surface view of your skin. Notice that it's not as organized as a snake skin. Okay. What does that say about us? I don't know. Okay. And then I wanted to show these two slides because these are examples of human cells that are not attached to each other, because here, those cells, like your skin cells, are attached to each other. But this is bone, and the cells are the small pink blobs, not the big one. The big one is a blood vessel, but like that, and that, and that, and that. And what do you suppose is between them? You're not seeing it?
No.
Oops. All right. The small pink blobs are cells. The light color white between them, what do you suppose that is?
I actually have to put.
Very good.
Wow.
Very good.
Whoa. Whoa.
Simply called calcium salts.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's where when you take calcium, that's where it's going, in the space between the cells. And if you can see closely, there's little pink lines between the big pink blobs, bigger pink blobs. Those are blood vessels to travel and communicate between the cells. This is a reason why bone heals so quickly, or, I mean, it feels like forever when you're in the middle of it, but For 6 weeks or so, your bone will heal because it's got a good blood supply. Cartilage does not heal that well. It does not have as good a blood supply, so it takes longer for that to occur. Then up at the top, those are blood cells. The purple stained ones are white blood cells, and the others are red blood cells. You can see that in a drop of blood, there's a whole lot more red blood cells than there are white blood cells. Red blood cells transport oxygen, so they're real important to us for breathing and then transporting once you've loaded them up in your lungs. The white blood cells, which look purple here because they've stained them so you can see them, are part of your immune system that help fight off infection and those kinds of issues, allergies and things like that. They're involved with that. And I wanted to show them to you because they are not attached to each other. They are independent cells floating around in liquid called plasma or serum. You've heard those words before? Okay. So, how long have we known about cells? Well, it took microscopes in the development of that to be able to see them because they are so small. There are some that if you have really good eyes, you might be able to see faintly, but if you want to see any detail or anything, you need a microscope. And this was improving and getting better and better back in the 1600s. So Robert Hooke was the first scientist to use a microscope, and that's what his looked like. And he saw cells that looked like that. Now, what he was looking at was bark of a tree, the cork portion of a tree, and what he was looking at were cells that were not alive. Working about the same time, but in a different country, was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and this is what his microscope looked like, and he was looking at living cells. He started with the pond water, and then he looked at some blood and all kinds of things, and there's drawings of all the different things that he saw up there. But until this time, there was like no clue what things were made of. You saw an adult individual and you thought, well, that's it. But here we go, starting to see what it's made of, what living things are made of. They're made of small things, not one big thing. So where do cells come from? Well, this is interesting. It's thought, and again, this is scientific evidence. Nobody was there, or nobody is here now that was there 3.8 billion years ago to actually know this, and that was before written language, so we don't have any written evidence, but based on scientific simulations since then, what we can do in the lab, it appears that the first cells formed from two different kinds of organic molecules. Organic molecules mean that they have carbon in them. Not to be confused with the organic label on your cereal box or something like that. This has nothing to do with whether it was grown with fertilizer or pesticides or anything like that. So the whole definition is, does it have carbon in it? Okay, so what we have here are two different molecules. We have a layer, which is actually a double layer around the outside of what are called phospholipids. What are those? They're fats that have both a water-loving and a water-fearing end of the molecule. So hydrophobic, they're afraid of water. Hydrophilic, they like water. And when you put a handful of these together, they will form up into a circle like this with a double layer with the water-loving part sticking out toward the water part. So this is all in water. And the water-fearing part pointing toward each other. And it's a lot like an Oreo cookie. If you dip an Oreo cookie in milk, it's the surface, the cookie, that absorbs the milk, not the frosting in the middle. And so that's an analogy that might help you remember. And if you put a handful of them in there, they will form up to this pseudo-cell kind of thing or circular thing, a lot like if you have mixed vinegar and oil to make salad dressing, and you shake it and then leave it alone, and then they'll separate. It's like here, they don't like the water part likes the water part, and the fat part likes the fat part. Okay, so that's what's forming the boundary around the outside. Inside is an informational molecule, and it happens to be the RNA molecule, which is similar to the DNA molecule, but it is smaller, it's shorter, and it's more fragile than DNA. And so originally, this is probably what formed, and later on, years and years later, DNA formed because it is a much longer molecule and it's more stable. RNA is not stable. So since then, since these initial cells were formed, all of the cells since then have been produced from other cells. I'd like to bring up my assistant here to tell you about what's inside a cell. This is my granddaughter Catalina, who will show you the Lego model that she made of cells. She's a Lego expert, and she's going to walk around and show it to you. And this is the pattern that she used, so I can tell you what it is you're looking at. Just go ahead. There's no such thing as a typical cell, because they're all different from each other. You can see these three alone are different from each other, but they all have some things in common. And so that's what this model is good for, is to tell you what you might find in a cell, no matter what shape it is. The biggest structure in the middle of it, and this would be true for animal cells, but not for plant cells, but for today we're talking about animal cells and human cells. The biggest structure is the nucleus, and it contains all of the DNA. No, let me take that back. It contains 99% of the DNA that you would find in a cell. There's another little structure here that also has DNA in it. We'll tell you about that in a minute. Then that stack of membranes up there is called the Golgi bodies, named for the scientist who discovered it. Then we have some mitochondria here in orange and blue, no, orange and yellow, and I will tell you in a minute what they do. Then something called a lysosome down here at the bottom, a vacuole. A vacuole is like a storage bag. And then smooth and rough ER. ER stands for endoplasmic reticulum, which is a large, huge word, which just means canal system. And when you look at it under the microscope, some of it has little dots on the outside of it called ribosomes. Excuse me. It's my hearing aids. Just a minute. Never mind. Sorry. Okay. So little dots on the outside of rough ER, and then the smooth ER does not have little dots on the outside. Now, after you've had a chance to look at the model, go back. Carolyn would like you to see a little bit more. Now, here's a picture, another picture that tells you what they do, what these parts do. Each of these cells is a lot like a whole organism. There's a part that does packaging and shipping, there's a waste disposal, there's a digestive portion, all this kind of thing in each and every cell. All right, so the lysosomes we mentioned a minute ago, they do waste processing. The mitochondria are the energy generators, they're the power plants. Just set it down, thank you. They take... They take the sugar molecules, the glucose molecules, and break it down and release the energy out into little carrier molecules. And that's more information than you need to know. But that's where the fuel processing takes place, is in mitochondria. I always tell students to think of them as the mighty mitochondria that are generating the energy. Then the ribosomes, which I mentioned, the little tiny ones, are where proteins are produced. So production factories. Then we have the smooth ER is where fat production takes place, where those phospholipids are made, and where fat processing takes place. The protein processing, after the ribosomes make it, happens in the rough ER. Then the nucleus is the control center where the DNA is. There's a boundary around the outside, and I meant to have Catalina point that out here. You would think of the surface as being all the same, like a piece of saran wrap is all the same, but the membrane around the outside of an animal cell has different regions with different proteins on it. So some are for attaching to other cells, and some are for allowing things to go inside, like water to go inside, and other regions are for things to be able to come outside, like a hormone, something like that. So this surface membrane is important, for one thing, for holding everything together so it doesn't explode like a balloon, but also it's important because it attaches to other cells and it lets things go in and out. All right, and then the Golgi apparatus does packing and shipping. Question back there? I'm seeing my two medical people kibitzing back here. So, Stan, would you hold your question till the end? Thank you. Okay, so that's what you'll find inside a typical cell if there was such a thing. Now, where else is the DNA? There's a little bit of DNA inside the mitochondria. And you go, oh, this is interesting. Okay. It's thought that, here's a scientific theory for which there is some evidence, but we're always learning new things, that possibly those mitochondria were free-living organisms at one point in time and moved inside a cell and helped the cell by being able to process the food that the cell took in by itself. So we may have heard the term symbiosis, where two things were living together, and in this case it was beneficial for both of them. So that's thought that that might be how mitochondria got inside regular cells and why it has its own DNA. It doesn't have a lot, and most of the genes are related to the actual function of breaking down the sugar and getting the energy into a usable form. Okay, so for humans, the first cell for a human forms when the egg or ovum, which contains one set of 23 chromosomes, is fused with one sperm that also has 23 chromosomes to produce a cell with two sets or 46 chromosomes. Process is called fertilization or conception, and the new cell of a new individual is called a zygote. Well, I love this picture. Y'all remember who Michael Phelps is?
Sure.
Okay. So when sperm enter the female reproductive tract and are headed for the ovum, there's usually just one ovum released, but there's millions of sperm. Well, some of them get lost going one way, some get lost a little farther along, some get lost a little bit farther along than that, but some of them eventually arrive at the ovum. And Michael Phelps, you recall, is the Olympic swimmer with all of the medals, and this great cartoon shows it. Michael Phelps might well be the first one to arrive at the ovum and be successful with fertilization. What's cool about this is that once one sperm has fertilized the egg, There's a change in the surface membrane of the ovum. It's an electrical change, and it throws all the rest of them off. So there's only one sperm that's successful in getting inside. And in this case, it will be Michael Phelps. So what happens then? Well, all right, and we all know where this happens. Happens in the fallopian tubes or the oviduct, real close to the ovary. A lot of people think it happens in the uterus. That is not the case. Happens out very near the ovary, and it takes a week for this activity that I'm about to show you here to happen as this zygote divides and divides and divides and travels along the fallopian tubes to get to the uterus. So go with a zygote of one cell with two sets of chromosomes. Then the cell divides by a process called mitosis. We've heard that before, maybe? Okay, and that's an exact copying. So the two cells now both have 46 chromosomes. That'll happen again. Now we've got a 4-cell stage, and now each of those cells has 46 chromosomes. On to the 16-cell stage, same thing, and then on up to the 32-cell stage. That's when these cells start to separate and form a hollow ball. So up to about 32 cells, they're all together, and then it starts to form this hollow ball called a blastocyst. It's at that point that the cells start to differentiate or become different from each other. Up till then, they're all exactly the same. And if twins are going to occur, identical twins, if identical twins are going to occur, it will happen usually at the 2-cell stage. Those cells, for some reason, will separate from each other, and each one will continue on its own developing stage. And there was something in the news just this week of a family where they separated at the 4-cell stage, and all 4 of them developed individually. So they're 4 identical siblings. Anybody see that besides me? Yeah. That was just this week. 4 identical siblings. How unusual is that?
Wow.
Very, very. Okay. What's the difference between identical twins and fraternal twins? Susan?
Didn't hear her. I can't hear her.
And fraternal are, all right. So she said that identical twins, as we just saw, are 1 egg and 1 sperm that then separate at the 2 or 4 cell stage. And fraternal twins are 2 eggs and 2 sperm. Just happening at the same time. Because it's most common for only 1 egg to be ovulated at a time, but it is not unusual at all for there to be 2, and you've seen 3 and 4 siblings, and all they are they're siblings. They're no more related to each other than any other brother and sister, or 2 sisters or 2 brothers. They just happen to be in the uterus growing at the same time. Okay, so moving on. It would take us 2 or 3 days to describe all of embryology, and I'm not going to do that, but I will tell you that from this hollow ball of cells, this blastocyst, these cells move apart from each other, and one little section divides differently from the others. That little section becomes part of the placenta and is where the developing blastocyst will attach to the mother, the wall of the mother, and then the rest of it forms 2 layers of cells called the endoderm and the ectoderm. And at about 3 weeks after conception, so at this point it's been embedded in the wall of the uterus for about a week or maybe 2 weeks, a 3rd layer will form. So altogether there are 3 layers of cells in this developing fetus, and that's where all of the organ systems will develop from. So you can see there's a lot of differentiation, a lot of changing in the cells. They're no longer all like they were when they were in a ball. Now they're becoming different from each other. The ectoderm gives rise to all of those structures that will face the outer surface of the body, so like skin and hair and nails and teeth. And then the endoderm produces things that face the inner surface of the body, like the stomach and the lungs and the intestines, those kinds of things. And the mesoderm, which meso means middle, produces everything that are between those two surfaces. So the muscles, the bone, the blood, the brain, spinal cord, nerves, all of that comes from that level. What makes us differentiate? This is where we could take an entire semester talking about this, but two major things. The first thing is the fact that the cells are next to each other. They will affect each other or impact each other in deciding what the fate of this particular cell should be. And then the other thing is that there are specific proteins that are produced by the DNA that cause special structures and functions to develop. So there's two big things. There's signal proteins that are made in the developing fetus to make it into an embryo, and then there are the relationship of the cells that are next to it deciding what it will become. So how many different types of human cells are there?
Lots.
Well, there are more than 300 different kinds of cells. So you probably are familiar with muscle cells, but did you know that there's 3 different kinds of muscle cells? There's the cardiac muscle cells that's in your heart. There are what called smooth or visceral muscle cells that are in the walls of your organs, like your stomach, lungs. And then there are skeletal muscles that are attached to your bones. And there's even 2 kinds of those. There are what are called fast twitch muscles, skeletal muscle cells, and those are really good if you're running a sprint. And then there are slow twitch muscle cells that are good if you run a marathon. So that's part of what helps determine whether an athlete will be a good sprinter or a marathoner based on the composition of their muscles. And that's genetic. So you can't make yourself have more fast twitch because you really want to run the sprint if you have more of the white twitch ones. How about nerve cells? Well, you know there's 3 different kinds. I've taught you that here. But there are also 6 different kinds of supporting cells, things that help neurons do their job. And you might have heard of myelin. That's a lining or a covering on the outside of some muscle cells, or excuse me, nerve cells, particularly this motor neurons. Okay, and that's made by one of these supporting cells. So if we're talking about nerve, we're talking about at least 9 different kinds of cells, and probably more than that. Blood cells, we know that there are red ones and white ones, because we just saw that up there. But did you know there are 5 different kinds of white ones? So there's red, and then these 5 different kinds of white ones. And then there's something called platelets. If you've done a blood test, they might have counted your platelet count also. All right, we talked about what reds and whites do. The platelets are involved with your blood clotting process. Okay, what else? Bone cells. Well, you think there'd only be one kind, but there's 3. There are the regular bone cells, and then there are bone building cells and bone destroying cells. And as we deal with osteoporosis and things like that, the bone destroying cells are working faster than the bone building cells are. Because you can heal a broken bone, but over time, there's less and less calcium being put into bones by these bone building cells, and the bone destroying cells are more active. Okay, what else? Enzyme producing cells, oh boy. There's all kinds of enzymes. But let's think particularly about the ones in your mouth. Your salivary glands make enzymes. Ever chew on a cracker? And after you chew on it, it becomes sweet in the flavoring, kind of powdery when you start a soda cracker and then it gets sweet. That's because the enzymes in your mouth are starting to break down the starches in your cracker and turning it into sugar, so it'll taste sweet to you. There you go. Lots of enzymes in your stomach. There's enzymes. Your best enzyme making organ is your pancreas, and it makes the most of different kinds of enzymes. And then there's hormone producing cells in all of your glands, various kinds of those. Skin cells, there are lots of different kinds of those. There are the ones that make all the surface, but then, and that's waterproofing, so that you don't, desiccate, you don't evaporate when you're out in the sun, and you don't dry up like a snake, for example. Okay, but then also there are the melanin cells that give you the color to your skin, and some little clusters of those that make the moles that we worry about being causing or becoming out of control with cancer. So lots of cells with skin cells too. So there's estimated to be 37 trillion cells in one human. So here I stand in front of you, 37 trillion cells. Here's some more pictures of them. These are actual, some of them are actual. That's a diagram, obviously, of skin with layers of epidermis out on the surface. And these are dead cells out there, so you can brush off, you can exfoliate without becoming painful. But if you go down very far, then there are living cells down below that. And then the dermis is even below that. And you can see this Merkel cell thing is a nerve cell, so that's part of the sense of touch. But up here, this is a picture of a nerve cell, and these long tendril kind of things going off of it. They're called axons, and they're take the message, the chemical message, from one end of the cell to the other end of the cell. They're like wires between transformers or something like that. Okay. And then this is a pancreas. Now, I'm loving pancreas because each of those little dots there is an individual cell, and the darker pink ones make the enzymes, the digestive enzymes, but these little tiny ones over here make insulin, because we know that the pancreas does two things. It makes hormones, and it makes the digestive enzymes for breaking down our food molecules. Okay. And you would think that insulin were the only hormone produced by the pancreas, because that's the only one you ever hear about, but there are two more that it makes. It makes glucagon and somatostatin. Not that you care, but just a bit of information. Okay. This is cardiac muscle. How can I tell this? Because the cells are branched instead of being individual. They kind of branch into each other, and they have more than one nucleus in them. And that structure helps them to contract over and over and over again without rest. So the impulse starts at one end and it contracts, just like the wave cheer at the stadium, and then it'll relax, and then it'll do it again, and it contracts about every, Estelle, 3/10 of a second, and it relaxes 4/10 of a second, and then it recovers at 1/10, something like that, but 8/10 of a second for a full cardiac muscle contraction. Okay. And you can imagine, because it doesn't ever have a chance to rest more than a little bit, that it needs a lot of oxygen. And that's why keeping the cardiac arteries open so that the blood supply can take the water, the oxygen to every cell all of the time without any break is so important. And when they get blocked, that's when these cells starve, and that's when a heart attack occurs. All right, little more. So cells and your health. I mean, why do we care about this? Well, because all your good health happens at the cell level. And when something goes wrong, that's when you have medical issues. And so here's some examples of medical issues that happen when something's not working. So type 1 diabetes occurs when the pancreas cells, that little cluster I showed you, are not producing either any insulin or enough insulin. And that usually appears early on in life, although we have a friend here that we know that didn't get it until she was in her 40s. So, it can happen later, but usually if you have type 1 diabetes, it'll show up in childhood. Type 2 diabetes, much more common in us older people because the body cells either don't currently have or have lost the ability to use insulin. For it to work, it has to be absorbed into the cell, and it doesn't do that. In type 2 diabetes, usually associated with obesity or overweight. Okay. Then we mentioned osteoporosis a minute ago, and that the bone-destroying cells are happening faster, working faster than the bone-building cells. And osteopenia, you might have heard of that. That's kind of a halfway situation, that the bone-destroying cells haven't totally taken over, but it's on the way. And so that's when the doctor will say, start taking more calcium, more weight-bearing exercise, get those cells going again to get your bones back as strong as they were before. And then we mentioned that the myocardial infarction or heart attack is when that cardiac muscle doesn't have enough oxygen. Then here's some more. You may have heard of anemia, okay? All right, that's when your bone marrow doesn't produce enough red blood cells to carry oxygen to all the cells that need it. Now, there's lots of kinds of anemia. It can be because you don't have enough vitamin K or some other things as well. Some of the building block molecules for that those cells. Sickle cell anemia, you have heard of, I'm sure. This is a genetic issue. This is when the hemoglobin produced by the gene, which was inherited, has a small one amino acid change compared to the normal hemoglobin, and it causes the red blood cells not to be nice round jelly donut kind of shapes, but C-shaped or sickle-shaped, like a harvesting tool. Okay. And that is genetic, that causes that. Leukemia is another type of blood disorder where the bone marrow produces too many of the wrong kind of white blood cells. And lymphoma is when they are producing a specific kind of abnormal white blood cells, and also often collect or form tumors in the lymph node and the spleen. And then melanoma is when bone marrow cells produce cells that affect plasma cells. That's one of the kind of white blood cells that make the antibodies. So you can see lots of things can go wrong in the bone marrow, leading to all these different kinds of disorders that impact the blood. Okay. Where's the bone marrow? Well, we all know this because when we eat a nice big piece of meat with a bone in it, a nice round bone, that white stuff in the middle of the bone, that's the bone marrow. And you find it primarily in long bones in humans, so the femur is where the most of it is, but also in the humerus, the two arms, upper arm bones, and some other places in the hip bones, but primarily the femur is the greatest repository of bone marrow. Then here's a couple more. All three of these are related to nerve cells. Alzheimer's is when either extra protein accumulates on the outside of the neurons or on the inside of the neurons, and these are the neurons in the brain. So these guys. Then Parkinson's is an abnormal breakdown of neurons that make the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so plenty of dopamine allows good control of muscles, and when those cells are broken down and there's less dopamine, then there's less control of muscles. And then multiple sclerosis is when the immune system damages nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord and slows down or stops the transmission of impulses. So you can see that cells are really important to our good health. So cells have a life cycle, just you have, like humans have a life cycle. Okay? And what decides whether they will divide or not? Well, some of them divide throughout your life. Have you ever burned your mouth on pizza? You know that within a day or two, your taste buds are back again. And when you file your nails, they grow again, kinds of things. But there are others that divide very rarely in adulthood. Muscle divides rarely, so mostly you are born with all the muscles and the nerves that you ever have, and they will just get bigger as you grow. Okay. And it's thought that more than 330 billion cells, about 1% of them in your body, are replaced every day. So there's lots of this cell division and going on. So this is the cell life cycle, and I point out to you just that there are some checkpoints or some stop points along the way, and that's where cancer comes into this. So we start out with a brand new cell up there. That M stands for mitosis, so this arrow is a new cell, and G1 is what we call growth. So the first thing it does is grow, get bigger, and then it passes a signal point that says, you are getting so big, you're going to have to divide. And so then it moves on forward into the next phase. S stands for synthesis, because the first production the first step in getting ready to divide is make more DNA, copy the DNA, so that the daughter cells have the same amount that the original mother cell had. Then they move on into growing some more, and then it's ready to divide. And each of these has a checkpoint along the way, and if a cell is as big as it's ever supposed to get, usually based on crowding, how close it is to other cells near it, it'll stop in G1. And then after the DNA is synthesized, the cell checks to make sure that it's not been damaged. And if it's damaged, because mistakes happen in DNA replication all the time, and that it either has a chance to get fixed or the cell stops and it doesn't pass on that damage to any other cells. So this is what would happen in a normal cell. And what happens when cells go rogue, when this doesn't work? You might remember, I seem to remember back in the early 70s, when President Nixon spoke before the nation that the war on cancer, and we will solve this in the next 5 years. It was kind of following on the space race. We will go to the moon by so-and-so. All right, well, we're going to cure cancer. Well, at that point, we thought cancer was a disease of a bacterium or a virus. We had just cured smallpox, we had just cured polio, we had dealt with pneumonia, all of these things that were caused by little organisms that we could see under the microscope. But cancer is a disease of the cell cycle. It's a disease of the dividing. And if the dividing control is lost, then these cells will divide and divide and divide without stopping and make tumors. So we have here the nice normal one going on here, and then we've got abnormal division going on up there, being too crowded, too many cells in a small place. So for normal cell division, that's up there on the top, and if one is produced that is abnormal or damaged, then that cell will not continue on and be destroyed. But in cancer, it just keeps dividing, even if it's abnormal. So the cell cycle control is lost. It's thought that there are at least 5 cancer-causing genes in every one of our cells. Those are called oncogenes. But then there are also tumor suppressor genes in our cells as well, that normally have suppressed the oncogenes, kept the oncogene turned off so it's not affecting the cell cycle. But if something happens that causes the tumor suppressor gene to stop working, then the oncogene will turn on, and here goes the building of all these extra cells. Doctors and scientists have worked to try to determine what can keep the suppressor genes working and what keeps, what you can do to not let them turn off. And exercise and diet are 2 of the things that are the most likely way to help keep the tumor suppressor genes working fine and keep the oncogenes turned off. You must realize I'm telling you a real simple version of this here, right? So we're almost done. Here's an example of cells gone rogue. Okay? Breast cancer, abnormal cells produced in the breast tissue, multiplying uncontrollably, forming tumors. There's different kinds depending on what part of the breast tissue that's in. Are you in a lobule? Are you in a duct? Where are these abnormally dividing cells? In prostate cancer, they will form abnormal tumors in the prostate gland, and you may or may not know that the urethra passes right through the prostate gland, and so when it's full of cancer, it presses against the urethra and makes you have to go to the bathroom a lot faster. Lung cancer, again, there's more than one kind, depending on what part of the lung is affected. Is it in the little air sacs? Is it in the tissue between the air sacs? Is it in one of the lobes of your lungs? One side has 3 lobes, one side has 2 lobes. You sometimes hear that someone's had a lobe removed and that took all the cancer, and you can keep the rest of it working just fine. Then colon cancer is when there are abnormal cells in the colon multiplying uncontrollably and forming tumors. This is the fastest kind of cancer in the U.S. right now. So I know we hate it, but take your colonoscopies so that they can help address it very early on. And then skin cancer. I mean, I know everybody in here goes at least twice a year, and we all get checked. We see people in the dining room with bandages on because we are going to not die of skin cancer. We are going to have it taken care of, and that's a good thing to do. So I have 7 minutes. Are there any questions? Remember, I'm not a doctor and I'm not a pharmacist.
What did you do before you retired?
I taught this biology class for 31 years at Valencia College. I love it. As you can tell, and thank you for listening to it. Any other questions that I can answer? Georgianne?
Is there outside factors, like I have a son, not having sunscreen?
For skin cancer?
Are there other outside factors that affect some of the cancer?
Primarily the UVA and UVB rays from the sun is what. It's a kind of radiation. I mean,
Breast cancer or lung
oh.
cancer, there's some outside factors.
Well, let's see, we know that some lung cancers are caused by chemicals that you breathe, so smoking or asbestos or, pesticides, if you worked in pesticides, those kinds of things. That would be an external something. Radiation, if you ever were in a situation where you were exposed to an extra amount of radiation. This is interesting, this is my mother's story. She had a tumor on her thyroid gland, and she traced it back to determine that when she was growing up and going to the shoe store, they would have you stand on the box and x-ray your feet to determine what size your shoes were. And she determined that that's where that came from in her life.
Wow.
Have you experienced that? Yeah.
Wow.
And these days, when they do dental x-rays, you put on the lead apron because they're trying to protect, this from happening.
Thyroid, yeah.
Yeah. Other? You can let me get away with 4 minutes left? Then I will give you my final slide.
Yeah, that was fun.
Thank you for listening. Let's go.